Okay, we begin Daf Tes Vav Amud Beis 15b at the Mishnah. Sheyara shachatza bebika mekifua kli behema. A caravan is out in a field. They're traveling and they need a place for Shabbos, so they stop and they need to set up camp. And they want to be able to carry within the space, so they set up and encircle their camp with saddles and camels and whatever vessels they have from the saddles, from the packages. And as long as it's 10 tefachim high, and that's going to be enough of an enclosure. And as we'll see, there can be gaps between the packages as long as they are less than the packages themselves. And then they can carry within there. As long as it is 10 tefachim high, which let's say is 30 inches or so. And the gaps may not be larger than what is the structure, what is intact. And also, any gap that's 10 amos in size is fine, because that's just like an opening. However, yeser mikan, if it's more than 10 amos usser, then you're not allowed to carry within there, because that would not be an opening anymore. That is a lack of structure, a lack of wall. So we have over here this makeshift enclosure. As long as it's 10 tefachim high, it doesn't make a difference if there are gaps, as long as the gaps are less than the open than the standing makeshift wall made out of these packages, and as long as no opening is more than 10 amos. Itmer, parts ka'imit. What happens if it is exactly 50% is enclosed and 50% is open? So Rav Papa says that's sufficient, and you're allowed to carry within it. However, Rav Huna bar Yeshua Amar Aser, that it's prohibited. It has to be more enclosed, according to Rav Huna bar Yeshua, and Rav Papa says even 50-50 exactly is fine. Tues here gets into the concept of whether we assume that a person can be so exacting to have it 50-50, but either way, that's the halacha that they argue about. So Rav Papa Muter Rav Papa says it's permissible because the concept that was given to Moshe. We know that the Gemara mentioned earlier that shiurin mechitzin are halacha Sinai, measures and boundaries, barriers are halacha Sinai. And so the way it was said to Moshe is you need 50% standing. Don't have more than 50% open. And Rav Huna bar Yeshua have majority fenced in, majority standing wall, as opposed to don't have majority open.
Could I ask a quick question? The Mishnah puts a case of a shayara and clay behema. Would it make any difference if it's not a shayara and it's not clay behema? Is it any if you piled up anything and it's 10 tfachim and you made mechitzas, would that be okay anywhere, anytime?
Well, almost anywhere, anytime. But we'll see later in the Gemara if there's a maximum for something like this, but in size. But the Mishnah is talking about a classic case where you're going to have somebody make a mechitza out of packages. That's going to be in a caravan. But if you had a group of backpackers and they took off their backpacks and stood them up, and each one's 10 tefachim high, and you made a little enclosure like that would also count. Or if you just did that in your backyard, that would also count. The Diber HaKasab HaHove, the Mishnah is talking about something that's a common occurrence. That's where you need to enclose something for Shabbos. It's a caravan that stops and needs to enclose something for them to live in. Tonight we learn we learn that you should not have more breeches, then you have structure. Hakabinyan mutter, which indicates that if it is equal 50-50, it'll be permissible. So Gemara says, no, don't deduce that. Ella ema imbinyan yeser al pizza mutter. Rather, that if the structure is more than the breeches, then it's going to be okay. So Gemara says, wait, aval kabinyan mai asa, but if it's exactly 50-50, then one, it would be prohibited. Well, then why don't you say the breeches should not be as much as the structure? Kasha, that's a question. Gemara is not so bothered by it enough to contradict the opinion, because that's some, it's less than common to get a 50-50. So Gemara said it shouldn't be more, but it also could have meant it shouldn't be less. Tashama. Somebody who used rods that as his sukkah top. Now these are invalid as sukkah tops, even if or bed frame rods. There's enough space between them, equal to the rods themselves, these invalid schach, that you can put kosher schach. It's going to be kosher. So what we see is that it's 50-50, and because it says you have enough space, equal space between them, and it's going to be kosher. So you see 50% kosher, 50% not, counts as a good schach. So too we would say here 50% 50% standing wall, 50% the gap is going to be a valid wall. So Gemara says, now actually the schach between the rods can slide in and out easily, meaning that it is wider, the gap is a little bit wider than the amount that the rod is, and that's why it's going to be kosher. But if not for that, if it was exactly 50-50, it would not be kosher. But you can make it narrower, meaning that you could it could be exactly exactly the same size. Yes, even though it's true that a person could be exacting, but the case that Rav Huna Rav Yeshua is talking about is that he made it loose enough that he could slide the schach, kosher schach, in and out, which means that there's a little more kosher schach than the non-kosher schach. However, Rava says actually the schach was lying perpendicular to these rods, and these rods are just the supports. That they were aligned the other way, and they were sitting directly on the rods, and so the rods are really just supporting them. Tashama. So we'll try and prove it from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah's case was a shiyara, a caravan, and they enclosed it with these packages. So the Brisa explains what did that look like. They had the camels rest and held them down, and so they're sitting in one spot, and then next to it is akufas, ukafas, their saddles, ba'abitin, the cushions that sit beneath the saddle, u'mishalifin, and in the packages, bekanim, bundles of reeds, mikulaches, bundles of vegetables. So all these, they take all these piles and all these packages and all of the animals and the saddles, and they just pile them up and make encircle their camp. Matalta b'tachas, you're allowed to carry within there. However, as long as you don't have a gap between each camel, the size of a camel, and you don't have a gap between each saddle, the size of a saddle. Ubein abit la abit kamle abit, and between each pillow, the size of a pillow. So since it says you shouldn't have that much space between, meaning that it has to be more standing. Sorry, if it's equal, it would be fine. That there's actually a greater gap. That's where Avuna Brei Yeshua is going to say. Tashamat, let's try prove from here. So for the next part, we're going to get into a new discussion of walls and boundaries, which require a reminder of some of the concepts we learned already. There's the first concept is lavud. Lavud is a concept where if you have a gap of less than 3 tefachim, that gap is considered closed. It's not considered a gap, even though that you only have a little bit of material, and then a gap of, let's say, 2.5 tefachim, and then some material, and then a gap of 2.5 tefachim and a material, that counts as if it's all enclosed, because Lavud says that if it's less than a 3 tefachim gap, that counts as fully enclosed. Think of a chain link fence. There's much more, the gaps are much larger than the fence itself, because the fence is a thin wire, not such a thin wire, but it's a wire in some rectangular shapes or diamond shapes, and it counts as a full wall because the gaps don't count. So that's the concept of lavud. And we have the concept of omed meruba ala paretz or kaparetz, where you have more standing wall than the breach, or the exact amount standing wall of the breach. We have a concept of a 4 tefachim wall being a solid wall, and in and of itself of value. We also learned the concept that if you have a gap, and then a wall, and then a gap, if the total gap is larger than the wall, and we saw various opinions earlier whether each gap alone is larger than the standing wall, or combined they're larger than the standing wall, it'll swallow and absorb and invalidate the wall between them. Meaning, if let's say we had a 3 tefachim gap, and then a 3 tefachim wall, and then a 3 tefachim gap, that would swallow the solid wall. The airspace on both sides will swallow the wall, and it's as if it's not there. Some say no, it's equal, so it won't swallow it. But if you had a gap of 3 tefachim, and then a standing wall of 2.5, and then a gap of 3, or perhaps if they combine to greater than the standing wall, it would swallow it. So we saw the various opinions, but the concept is asavir dahai, the wall, the airspace on both sides of the standing material would swallow it up because it is greater than the standing solid wall. So we have these concepts, and now the Gemara is going to tell us brisa of what are the minimum spaces the maximum gaps and the minimum standing wall that would count as valid wall. They're going to give us 3 different halachas. Nimtzes. So we find, here's what you have. Nimtzes ata omer sholosh midas b'machitzas. There are 3 measures or 3 halachas in regards to these gaps and wall, in regards to a proper barrier, proper mechitza. As long as the standing wall is less than 3 tefachim, meaning, let's say you have rods or reeds or posts, and each one is less than 3 tefachim, let's say 10 inches, then the gap between each one must be less than 3 tefachim. So that a goat cannot just walk out between them. So if you have a 1-inch post and then a less than 3 tefachim gap, and then a 1-inch post, and then a less than 3 tefachim gap, and a 1-inch post, all around your enclosure, that counts as a solid wall. Just as your chain link fence, where the gaps are way bigger than the fencing, but it counts as a solid fence wall. Kol shehu gimel. However, if you have an actual 3 tefachim piece of wood or a post, umigimel adalet, up to 4 tefachim, tzarich shelo yehei bein zeh lezeh k'maloi. There, the gap between them cannot be larger than the gap than the standing wall itself. So that the gaps not equal the amount of standing wall. And this is going to be the point that the Gemara is going to try and use as proof that it says the gaps cannot equal the standing wall, which it contradicts Rav Papa, who says that if it's exactly the same, it's going to be okay. And here it says it's not. But in any case, first we're going through the halachas that the Bryce is telling us. It says, that means if you have a 3 tefachim or 3.5 tefach post, your gap may not equal that. However, if you end up with a greater gaps total than the standing wall, then it'll absorb the standing walls, and the standing walls are totally non-existent, and it doesn't count as a valid space, even if you were standing directly against the standing wall. And so you say, here I have a barrier. No, that barrier is non-existent. Now, kol shehu midalad v'arba, but if it's more than 4 tefachim and more, up until 10 amos, so then the wall is going to count as a solid wall regardless. So that you can't have a larger gap than the wall. So that the gaps not equal the standing wall. However, if you do have more gap than you have standing wall, so if you're directly by a standing wall mutter, so there you're enclosed by those standing walls, and you're going to be okay. But against a gap you cannot carry, and that's going to be prohibited. Usr. So that's going to be prohibited. If you have greater wall, total amount of standing wall is greater than the gaps. So you have a 5 amma wall, and then a gap of 5 amma, and a 5 amma wall, and a 4 amma gap. So you have, in total, you have more wall than gaps. So then you're allowed to carry even against the open space, because that just counts as an opening. Unless you have an opening that the opening in one spot is greater than 10 amos, let's say 15 feet, that's going to be too much of an opening. That's no longer an opening, that's a breach in the wall, and that would prohibit carrying within it. If you have posts just that can stab into the ground, basically angled posts that stick in the ground, and he made brought a string or a vine across from one post to the other on top, so made a doorway. So then he can then the gap is allowed to be even more than 10 amos. So this is the brisa with openings. Again, if you have solid wall, I'm going to go backwards in the brisa. If you have solid wall more than 4 tefachim, so then as long as the gaps are less than the standing wall, so you have more solid wall than gaps, and none of the gaps are 10 amas or larger than 10 amas, unless it has a door frame in there, such as putting a string over the posts, then you're allowed to carry within there. However, if the gaps are larger than or a greater amount than the standing wall, then you're not allowed to carry against the gaps, but you can against the standing walls. If it's between 3 tefachim and 4 tefachim of posts, then you can only carry in there if it is the openings are smaller than the standing wall. But if you have the standing, but if it's larger, even against the standing wall, you may not carry, because that gets absorbed by the greater openings. If, however, the gaps are less than 3 tefachim, then even if your posts are minuscule, maybe just an inch, and your gap is 3 tefachim, let's say 10 inches. So you have an inch and then 10 inches and an inch and 10 inches. That's going to count as lavud, and it's going to count as a solid wall. So that's the halacha in regards to gaps and openings in your wall. Katani miyas Reisha, but in the first teaching, in the first section, we learned between 3 and 4 tefachim of posts, the gaps cannot be greater to yufta the same, meaning that your gaps have to be smaller than the standing wall to yufta darav papa. That's a contradictor. Rav Papa said that it was equal. It would still be valid. It only can't be greater amount of gap. But the Brisa said equal is going to be no good. Amalchar of Papa, my meloy nechras v'yitzit. He says, no, what does it mean that it can't be the size of the standing wall, meaning the gaps cannot be greater where the standing wall itself can fit in and out. And it seems logical that way, because in the next section it says, when is it invalid? If the gaps are greater than the standing wall. So it tells us that the gap, that if your gap is greater than the total wall, that's when it's going to be invalid. Seemingly equal is going to be okay. And that it's going to be invalid even against the standing wall. Tells you if it's equal, it's going to be okay. So that seems to be proof. So then let's say that the Brisa is actually contradiction to the other opinion. Rav Huna ber Yeshua said that if they are equal gaps to standing wall, it's going to be invalid. And why? Our Brisa seems to say that only if it is greater gaps than wall, it's going to be invalid. Amalacha. So Rav Huna ber Yeshua is going to say, wait, it's self-contradictory in the Brisa anyhow. Well, if you're going to look at the Brisa that way and analyze the wording, Ema Sefer, look at the end. It says if the standing wall is greater than the gaps, so then you can carry even where the gap is. I can deduce from there where if it was equal, Aser, it's going to be prohibited. So Sefer Kasha or Papa. So the end of the Brisa is going to be difficult to Rav Papa, and Reisha Kasha Rav Huna, and the beginning is going to be a question to Rav Huna ber Yeshua. And the Gemara says, obviously, it's not a question because you cannot deduce one from the other. They're just speaking in a more common manner and saying, if this is greater versus if that's greater. What about 50-50? It's not really addressing it. And so each one's going to say, really, 50-50 is like I say, either good or not good. And the reason it said in the other part of the Brisa that the gap is greater or that the standing is greater, because it's using this symmetrical speech the same manner that it said it in the other way, but the true halacha is like the one version versus the other. So Seifa Papa Lekasha, I did Tani Reisha Parts Merubal Aimet, Tani Seifa Aimet Merubal Parts. Since at the beginning of the Brisa it mentioned that the gaps cannot be greater than the standing wall, so therefore at the end it also said the standing wall if it's greater than the gaps. But it's true, even if it's equal. And Rachel Rav Huna ber Yeshua like Kasha, Rav Huna ber Yeshua is going to say the same about in the reverse. I did a Since the halacha is at the end of the Brisa that if the standing wall is greater than the gaps, it's going to be kosher. So we use a symmetrical form of speech, and in the beginning it says if the gaps are greater, but the truth is even if the gaps are equal, it'd be the same. So either way, the brisa is not going to be proof to either opinion. Now the Gemara says, "Bishlam our Papa Mishram Hachili Ariv Luhu Vetani Luhu." So according to our Papa, it says that equal gaps to standing wall are going to be valid. So therefore, it didn't include it in one statement. But according to Rav Huna Bereder Yeshua, that it has to be more standing wall than gaps, and gaps equal to standing wall are going to be invalid. Why didn't the Brisa put it all as one? Anything that's less than 3 tefachim of a post. Or if it is 3 tefachim, anything less than 3 tefachim a gap, or 3 tefachim, it has to be that you don't have 3 gap with it. Sagmar says no comparison. They're 2 different invalidations. The first invalidation is different than the second, as we mentioned. The first invalidation is that you don't have a lavud. You don't have lavud, which is encloses a gap of less than 3. Once you're up to 3, it no longer is that way, and and a goat can go through and invalidate it. Psula de Seifa, the reason, the next section, the reason it's invalid is Shalei Paratz Ka'emet. There, it's because the gap is going to be as much as your solid wall, and that's going to be invalid. So now the Gemara is going to analyze the first 2 sections of this brisa. We had the first statement that said lavud is 3 tefachim. As long as you're up to 3 tefachim, let's say 10 inches. As long as you're up to 3 tefachim, a gap, then you can have even just a thin 1-inch post, and it's going to count as completely enclosed. That's the opinion of the Chachamim. We know Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says lavud, this concept of an enclosure just by the gaps being virtually enclosed by the solid. According to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that's actually for 4 tefachim, not up to 4 tefachim, not up to 3 tefachim. So our brisa, which mentions it up to 3 tefachim, must be the opinion of the Chachamim, the general opinion, and not that of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. So then, where do we get this concept of up to 4 tefachim for a solid wall? Mani, whose opinion is this? Rabbanan idabri pachas b'shleisha amrina lavud, who say up to 3 tefachim counts as lavud. Shleisha lo amrina lavud, but at 3 we no longer say lavud. Ema Seifa, look at the next section of the brisa. Kol shu shleisha mishleisha v'ad arba. As long as you have 3 tefachim or up to 4 tefachim, that's going to count as an okay gap as long as you have equal or larger solid wall. Whose opinion is that? So now we turn to Tazayin Amud Beis, 15b, 16b. Asan Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. So that seems the opinion of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that there's a lavud concept of up to 4 tefachim. Because if you're going to say this is the opinion of the Rabbanan, 3, 4 is all the same according to Rabbanan, it's a gap. So Abaye says you're right. The opinion of this, the opinions of this brisa are based on the lavud of the Rabbanan, which is a gap of up to 3 tefachim. That's lavud. However, there's another concept which we spoke about. This is not on account of lavud, that it's as if the gap is enclosed, but rather the gap remains there. And it is a gap, but it's valid nevertheless because you have more standing wall. Seifa Nami Rabbanan. And the second part of the brisa is also the opinion of the Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan agree. The Chol, the Mishra Kenegdoi, as long as you want to permit to carry against the standing wall, if you have a solid 4 tefachim wall, then you can carry against the solid wall. But if you don't have 4 tefachim of solid wall, which allows you to have a gap of up to 4, then your solid wall is only a post of, let's say, 3.5 tefachim. You're not allowed to have a gap of more than or equal to 3 tefachim, 3.5 tefachim.
So you said that. So you said that the shiurim are all halach Moshe Sinai, right?
Yeah.
So they're in fact they're arguing on what is halach Moshe Sinai here.
No, they both agree there is a concept of halacha Moshe Sinai of lavud. They're not disagreeing about that. They're disagreeing about the maximum measure.
And Moshe wasn't Moshe what the maximum measure was?
For sure it was. For sure he did.
There's a breakdown in the transmission.
Correct. And the same we have on this question of paretz ka'omed, on larger gaps or equal gaps would be invalid. Rava Amar, however, Rava says, both the beginning and end of the Brisa are all the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who say that a maximum lavud is up to 4 tefachim. And that's why it would count as a solid wall if you have a gap of up to 4 tefachim. But nevertheless, where would Reb Shimon Gamliel say that there's a lavud that's above, where goats don't go, but below, where goats can break through, or even on the side down to the bottom, where goats can break through, there a maximum of lavud is 3 tefachim. And since goats can break through on 3 tefachim, it doesn't count as lavud down at the bottom of the wall. There, Reb Shimon Gamliel agrees. Tashema, we saw earlier this concept. If you had a wall of a courtyard, and there were more doors and windows, and as we saw, windows don't have a pane in them. They're just like openings in the wall. More doors and windows than solid wall. Mutter, it's going to be valid. As long as you have more solid, more standing than gaps. The Gemara says, wait, that's self-contradictory. Sheruban salkadaitach, can it really be that you have more gaps and windows, doors and windows than solid? You just said the standing has to be greater than the wall. The first line in the Mishnah doesn't mean there's more, but he added. So if somebody cut out more doorways and more windows within the courtyard wall, as long as the majority remains standing, it's going to be valid. As long as the majority is standing wall. Well, that seems to contradict Rav Papa, because Rav Papa said equal standing and gaps is also going to be okay. But from this brisa, from this Mishnah, we can deduce hakaparetz aser. If it's actually equal, it's going to be invalid. To Yufta to Rav Papa. That seems a contradiction to Rav Papa. To Yufta, indeed, it is a contradiction to Rav Papa. Vehilchasa. And what is the halacha? Rav Papa, like Rav Papa, kavasei to Rav Papa. So what are you talking about? To Yufta vehilchasa? You tell me that this is a contradiction to Rav Papa, and then you tell me the halacha is like Rav Papa? Yes, indeed. Why? Because the Mishnah seems to be clearly like Rav Papa. The Tanan, as we learned, because it says you cannot have greater, in our Mishnah, it says you cannot have a greater gaps than the standing, this person, this caravan that's making an enclosure with bags and saddles and camels, etc. The gaps may not be greater than the standing. So our Mishnah clearly says that if the gaps are equal, it's going to be okay, and that is the halacha. If it's exactly 50-50, it's going to be okay. Hakabinyan mutter, if they are equal, it's okay. Just as we just saw this question now in regards to how large the gaps can be in the vertical posts and wall between and of wall and then gaps between them. We're now going to have horizontal posts and a building a fence that way. So you know these fences. You have a log, and then a gap, and then another log, and a gap, and another log. That would count as a solid fence because of lavud. As long as the gap is less than 3 tefachim on each one of the gaps, then you have a total of 10 tefachim high wall made out of 3 posts. And the Mishnah is going to tell us you can even use rope, something less solid, and you tie those ropes. And as long as the gaps are less than 3 tefachim, and the total amount of rope you have equals 1 and a bit tefach, so that would give you a total of 10 tefachim. So you have, let's say, 2.9 tefach of gap at the bottom. Then you have a rope of, let's say, 0.35 of a tefach. And then you have a gap of, again, 2.9. And then a rope of 0.35. And then you have a gap of 2.9. And then, again, a rope of 0.35. So you have a total of 1 tefach of rope plus a little bit, and you have a total of 9 or just shy of 9 tefachim in gaps. So that totals from the ground to the top of your top rope. It totals 10 tefachim. That's enough to have a wall. So so you can encircle your camp or whatever it is you're encircling to be allowed to carry in Shabbos with ropes. Zulam alam izu, one above the other. Zulam alam izu, and another above that. As long as your gaps between one rope and the other, and then the ground, are no less than 3 tefachim, no more than 3 tefachim. It's actually less than 3 tefachim. 3 tefachim equal also not be loved. It has to be less than 3 tefachim. And shir chavalim ovyan yeser al tefach, and the total of your ropes has to be just a little more than a tefach, so that kadeshe hakol esar tefachim, so that the total fence that you just made or barrier that you just made is a total of 10 tefachim, as we just explained. A gap of just shy of 3, and then a rope just more than a third, and then a gap of shy of 3 tefachim, a rope just more than a third, etc. This way you have just about 9 tefachim of gap and a little more than 1 tefach of rope. That gives you a total of 10 tefachim, and it's a good barrier. Makif and mekanim, you can do the same with reeds. What was that, John? I didn't read it.
So if you took a net and wrapped it all the way around your space, that wouldn't work?
That would work, for sure. Why wouldn't it work?
Because if you add the width of all of the individual strings, it would potentially be less than a tefach.
No. The tefach over here is only because your gaps are going to be maximum 3 tefachim. As long as you have no more gap than 3 tefachim, it's going to be valid. So think chain link fence, right? Since your gap, even though it's greater than the solid, but it's less than 3 tefachim, that's okay. Only in where you're having ropes, where the maximum gap, you're trying to have the minimum amount of ropes. That's what the Mishnah is trying to do. So your gaps are going to be less than 3 tefachim, just shy. And so if you're going to have 3 gaps, you're going to need a total of rope of more than a tefach. But if, let's say, I had a fishing wire, okay? So I had these very thin, they're not going to equal a tefach. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having just 3 ropes around, I'm going to do 10. And I'm going to do a tefach and then a rope, and then a tefach and then a rope, and then a fishing wire, and then a tefach and fishing wire, a tefach and fishing wire. I'm going to have a total of 10 tefachim, even though I don't have the density or the thickness of the total of the fishing wire. It doesn't equal a tefach, but I don't have any gaps of 3 tefachim. So that constitutes as lavud, where it's completely solid.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. So again, reeds can be the same thing. I can put rods in the ground, even though each one is thin. Or if I cut down a field and there's the bald spot of the field is where I'm going to encamp, and the wall on the side is the actual overgrowth. That's going to count as well because the gaps between them are less than 3 tefachim. Now, B'shiyaru Dibru, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says this is only true that you can be lenient when you're with an encampment. However, if you're with just yourself, you want to do this in your backyard, it's not valid. And we'll see what Rabbi Yehuda is limiting. And as Michael asked earlier, is this true only by a shiyara, only by a caravan? And the answer is Rabbi Yehuda says that one part of the halacha is only for a caravan, but the majority of this halacha applies to everyone. However, the chachamim might relate to shiyara. No, really, it's true for everyone, regardless of where it is and where you're camping and what you're doing. It's simply that classically, who needs to make an encampment like this? It's a shiyara, it's a caravan traveling. Rabbi Yosef says, classically, you need the barrier, the boundary has to be enclosed by something that is both vertical and horizontal. Either vertical or horizontal. You don't need it to be both. What we've said is that if you have the majority of wall more than the parts, more than the gaps, is true when you have a horizontal upright, as we were talking about before, an upright wall. So reeds or posts. There, we said that as long as the gaps are less than the standing wall, it's going to be okay. What about in our Mishnah when you have the horizontal posts, the horizontal ropes? Does it need to be that the gaps are less than the solid wall, or can it even be greater than the solid wall? Well, look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that the ropes have to equal 1 tefach, which will, and a little bit, which will be total of 10 tefachim tall. Ve'isa lama li yeser al tefach liavid pachas b'shleisha v'chevel mashahu. If it's true, like you say, that you can have greater gaps than the solid when it's horizontal, and only vertical it has to be equal. Well, we have another way of fixing a fence by ropes when they're horizontal. What would he do? He would make a gap of less than 3 tefachim at the bottom, and then a very thin rope, let's say fishing wire. Then again, pachas mishlosha, and then you have another gap of less than 3 tefachim. So far, you're only 6 tefachim or even less. And then v'chevel mashu, and a fishing wire, a very thin rope. Pachas me'arba, and then you would have a gap of 4, because in order to get to 10, you only had a gap of 3, and now you're going to need a gap of 4 because the wire itself is nearly nothing. V'chevel mashu, and then just a fishing wire, and that would be sufficient, because right now you don't have a gap of 3 at the bottom, and even though you don't have lavud, which says that you enclose the top, but if you had lavud for 2 of those gaps, meaning you have less than 3 tefachim on 2 of the gaps, so it's like you have a solid 6 tefach. And if you have a solid 6 tefachim, so then you can have a gap of 4 because the majority is standing. V'tizbara. So Gemara says, where are you going to put that 4 gap? Where would that be? If it's in the lowest gap, for sure that would be invalid because goats can get through. And that wouldn't be valid. If it's going to be at the top, well, at the top, you have a gap of 4, which does not count as solid because it's more than lavud. And above that, you also have a gap from the fishing wire all the way to the sky. So the airspace on either side of this thin rope is going to come and swallow it up, and it's going to be nothing. So where would you put the gap of 4? It must be the gap of 4. Must be that it's in the middle. And that would count as more solid than the gaps because you have a less than 3, which counts as a solid. And above you have less than 3 that counts as a solid. And in the middle, you have that gap of 4. Mishtei ruchas. Shmas mina. Oimid merubal aparts. Mishtei ruchas have oimid. So we're out of time. I want to get to this concept tomorrow, which was the question we had. When you have a total more gap than the solid, but each one alone does not equal the gap. Does that count as enclosing the gap? Do we need them to be equal individually, or can the 2 solids combined be greater than the gap? We'll see this tomorrow. Bez Hashem, Yasher Koach.